All right, so the webinar is started. We'll just wait a few minutes for people to join. Okay, I think I'll get started. My name is Mark Weicker, and welcome to the Special Education Legal Clinic. This is, as you might know, a monthly workshop that we do, and this is the one component of the Special Ed Legal Clinic is the workshop that we do online. And then another component is individual guidance sessions that you have the opportunity to schedule with an attorney or an advocate following the workshop. So some of you may be registered for individual guidance session. If you haven't done that before, you can still register for the following month's individual guidance sessions. They follow the workshop, like I said, from 1 to 3, and they're about 30 minutes long. And they're held by Zoom too, but it's a private session, again, that you would have with an individual or an attorney. Our topic today for the workshop is restraint and seclusion and threat assessments. And we're going to flip that a little bit. We're going to start with threat assessments. Me and Danielle will start by talking about threat assessments and the change in the law in regards to threat assessments. And then Renee and Paige will continue and talk about restraint and seclusion and a few changes in that regard in the law. A few housekeeping items. We do have a Q&A, so if you have questions, you're welcome to put those in the box. If we have time, we'll answer those as we go. And if not, we do have time reserved at the end, about 15 minutes. So this will be an hour-long presentation, but 15 minutes of it, the last 15 minutes is reserved for questions. So depending on how we're going, we may answer the questions as we go or answer them at the end. The Q&A at the end is also an opportunity to ask questions related or unrelated to the workshop. So feel free to do that. We have, a few of us here, so we'll do our best to get those answered. And if we can't answer them, we'll try to find an answer and get back in touch with you by email. Most of you or all of you have registered through this portal that we have, lawyersforstudents.com/legal clinic. That is where the list of workshops is listed online, and it's also where the same page where you register for both the workshop and the individual guidance session. This is the the fourth in a series that we're doing. So I should have mentioned this is the Special Ed Legal Clinic is a collaboration between Albite Weicker, the Ohio Coalition for the Education of Children with Disabilities, and Disability Rights Ohio. And so with this series, this is our third series of workshops, and we're 4 workshops in, and we're kind of taking turns or collaborating on the workshops. This one in particular is a collaboration by all 3 organizations on the topic. So you can register for any or all of those workshops at that same URL that I just mentioned. Next month, Disability Rights Ohio is going to do a presentation on assistive technology. And you may have recognized too that these are always the third Mondays of the month at noon. So this whole series will be scheduled on the third Monday of the month at noon. Okay, well, I'm going to kick it off here with a conversation about threat assessments and the state of the law and the change in the law in regards to threat assessments. My name, like I said, is Mark Weicker. I'm an attorney with Albite Weicker in private practice. I represent students in all areas of education, including special education. And just as a quick run through, I'm joined here by Renee Stromsky, also a special education attorney with Albite Weicker, Danielle Randolph, who is an advocate, special education advocate with Albite Weicker, Tammy Sebastian with the Ohio Coalition for the Education of Children with Disabilities, and Paige Peel from Disability Rights Ohio. Thank you all for joining me. And let's start with threat assessments. Just kind of a little bit of background. We're going to talk about a law that's been enacted in Ohio that's going to require school districts to use threat assessments for students and non-students. The threat assessments really came about even before Parkland. It mentions Parkland there, but there was a nationwide push for threat assessments after the Parkland shooting in February of 2018. But even before that, there was a model that was put in place by the state of Virginia, starting back in 2013, and then updated in 2016 to include not just students, but all individuals, so that schools could assess the threat posed by anyone in the school community, because sometimes that includes students and sometimes it doesn't. So, but the real push nationwide came for all states to adopt some type of threat assessment model, came after Parkland. And just as a kind of a grim reminder, Parkland, if you remember, involved 19-year-old Nicholas Cruz, and he ended up killing 17 people from the school community and then injured another 17. So obviously not insignificant. It led to kind of a nationwide movement called March for Our Lives, and a lot of push for gun control and regulation, which, to some small extent happened, but largely has not. We also, if we're discussing the environment, we just had the 10-year, it's been 10 years as of December 14th, 2022, 10 years since the Sandy Hook shooting. So lots of things, unfortunate things that have happened that have led to kind of this adoption and then ultimately a nationwide increase in the use and the requirement to use threat assessments in the school environment. So the federal push really came from the Secret Service, and they published this document titled Enhancing School Safety Using a Threat Assessment Model. That was in July of 2018, and that document actually relied a lot on what Virginia was doing. Virginia, for whatever reason, was a little bit ahead of the game. They had a model that schools were already using and implementing for threat assessments even before, including in Ohio, which Danielle may be able to talk about, even before there was a requirement to do so. And I don't know necessarily why it started in Virginia. Of course, they had their own tragedy in 2007 at Virginia Tech. And I think they're on the order of 30 deaths. Don't quote me on what happened at Virginia Tech back in 2007. So maybe that was the impetus or the catalyst to push them to adopt some threat assessment. I know their threat assessment model did include higher education, so that's a good possibility that was some catalyst. But a lot of what was included in the guidance document from the U.S. Secret Service was taken from the Virginia model. So let's back up a step and talk about what a threat assessment is. And it's simply a strategy that analyzes the potential threat that a student presents and identifies an appropriate intervention designed to protect the student and other at schools. You may have heard me mention a second ago that at least in Virginia, they changed it back in 2016 for schools to be able to identify non-student threats as well. So employees, visitors, people who are in relationships with students or employees, or formerly in relationships with students and employees. So it broadened it. And you'll see in the Ohio law that passed, it also allows schools to do threat assessments on non-students. So even though the definition includes only students here, taken from the US Secret Service model, it does include non-students as well. And what's important, I guess, the reason we're talking about this, I mentioned I'm a student advocate. I'm an attorney who represents students in particular, worried about what laws and policies affect students and how they affect students. The reason we're really tuned into what's going on with threat assessments is, number one, we've seen threat assessments be used for students, both in good ways and bad ways. And it can be done well, and it can be done in a way that may be, that could potentially harm a student. So what's important about threat assessments, and now the requirement that schools use threat assessments, is that it ultimately forces a determination. It forces the school, through whatever committee they create, which we'll talk about, it forces a determination as to whether or not a student is a threat. You have these threat assessment teams. They can do that, again, properly. They may produce information that is helpful to the student or the school community about whether or not that student is a threat. But again, anything that's produced that's misleading or not, maybe inaccurate, could be problematic, for the student and their mental health and their future and their ability to stay in school. So that's why it's so important. I think it's important to start a conversation about, how schools are doing this, if they're doing it appropriately, things that are working and not working. And the requirement, as you'll see, hasn't started yet. We're talking about March of 2023. So we're leading up to this requirement that schools adopt these threat assessment teams, and that they make some determination in situations where these teams think it's appropriate. So it is a very important thing that's happening, and it's important that it happen, with fidelity and in a way that it protects the interest of students. All right, so the Ohio Threat Assessment Team. So the law, which is now codified in 3313-669, also called the Save Students Act, and that's an acronym for something I can't remember. But the law said it was adopted 2 years ago, so back in March of 2021, and then became effective in will become effective in March 24th in particular of 2023. And I'm just going to stop and check to see if no questions so far. So, and again, you're welcome to drop questions in the box if you have them. So as of March 24th, 2023, each school serving grades 6 through 12 must assemble these threat assessment teams. So who are these people? Number one, first thing to note, this is only public schools in Ohio. So private schools off the table, at least for the requirement. That's not to say they don't do it, or they may not do it, or they may do it anyway. But in terms of what's required, this only applies to public schools. And even the law itself doesn't include community schools, which is interesting. Community schools are public schools, but as the law is written, it only includes school districts, local school districts, city school districts, and even like a joint vocational center as well. So as of right now, no private schools are included, and community schools are not included.
Mark, there's a hand raised. I'm not sure if they're able to put that in the chat. I don't think they can unmute unless we're in a meeting capability. Gotcha. But there is a hand raised. So I'm not sure if they have a question.
Okay. Yeah, looks like Fatima has a hand raised. Fatima, if you if you do have a question, that may be a mistake, but if you do have a question, drop it in the box. Looks like she took it down, so maybe it was a mistake. Okay. The other thing that the law says is that these teams should be comprised of multidisciplinary professionals. So school administrators, mental health professionals, school resource officers, and other necessary personnel. Well, that's a should, unfortunately, not a shall. So that means, they may or may not be comprised of those individuals. I noticed the model policy, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that was put forth by the Ohio School Safety Center, does say if there is an SRO in the school, that person absolutely should be on the team. The other thing I noticed about the model policy is that even though the recommendation is that mental health professionals be included, it doesn't necessarily have that in the model policy. I would say it probably does benefit the threat assessment team to have a mental health professional, either inside or outside of the school, involved. I can see there might be some logistical challenges with that. If you have administrators, teachers, an SRO, and then somebody from the outside as part of the threat assessment team, it logistically may be hard to do that, but I would say it would be a good thing to have a mental health professional as part of the team if you can get one on the team. I know a lot of schools are starting to think about this, or may not have put their teams together, but that's something to think about. These team members, whoever they end up being, must complete threat assessment training every 3 years. And by way of example, the Ohio Attorney General has threat assessment training. There's a thing, an organization called Sandy Hook Promise, which does the training. And when I did this, I talked about this over the summer, those were the only two available on the Attorney General's website or ODE's website to provide the training for threat assessment teams. But now I look back and there's at least a dozen, there might be 20 different organizations that can provide the training for the threat assessment, the required threat assessment training. Another thing to keep in mind is that schools are already required to have an emergency management plan. This is really like school shooter training. This is, when there's an actual threat to the school, and those plans are submitted to the Ohio Attorney General, and they're confidential. They're not available under Ohio Public Records Law. So it's what they're going to do in the case of an emergency. And they also already have emergency management teams put together. And the law, this law 33-13-669, allows those schools to use the same emergency management team for their threat assessment team. So I'm guessing a lot of schools, because they have this committee already comprised, they'll do that. But I encourage anybody involved with the school, or if you're working with the school, to make sure that the committee, or I'm sorry, the threat assessment team is multidisciplinary. Make sure it has professionals from each of these disciplines.
Hey, Mark, I've got a question.
Yeah.
So do you know the background behind only requiring it for grades 6 through 12? Am I not elementary?
I don't. And the model policy doesn't say anything about that. The only thing I might take an educated guess about is that sometimes when you're implementing a new mandate to schools, they start, as little as possible and then increase as time goes on. And if I did read about, the Virginia model and read how it was adopted in 2013, amended. A couple of things they amended it to do, like I said, was to, allow or require threat assessments on non-students. They also passed a law in Virginia that allowed the school to get access to criminal records or juvenile records of students when they deemed the student was a threat. So my only educated guess on that, Danielle, would be that they are starting slow. Like it's like the low-hanging fruit with where the threat assessment probably has to be done or should be done. Perhaps there was some pushback from the legislature to the legislation too about assessing students so young. That would be my only guess.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
No, I just think about some of our students who are expelled because of making threats that are elementary age students. I had one who the district did do a threat assessment. We were able to kind of push back on the threat assessment, how it was done to not have the student expelled, but you don't see it very often. So it would be nice if it were a mandate for all students in public schools, so that perhaps students wouldn't be expelled for a threat that was not founded to be an actual threat. So
yeah, good question. And yeah, the real question is going to be whether or not schools take the time to adopt a team and policies and a threat assessment strategy that really works to identify behaviors and then addresses the behaviors really without the disciplinary component, because the disciplinary component, it should be separate. I know they're related, and there's no doubt they're related, but this is, I hope schools see it this way, about getting the students the interventions they need, which is not another interesting component, because when we talk about interventions, usually we're talking about only students on an IEP, but now this is going to require a threat assessment for any student who they deem may be a threat under their own definition, or who identifies some behaviors or signs that may be threatening. And so the outcome of this, if they determine that the threat is, a moderate or high risk, is that there should be an intervention plan in place for the student. And that's new, for the typical developing student. That's not something that they would normally have access to. And normally it just comes along with an IEP or a 504 plan. So it adds another component that relates to discipline, but doesn't necessarily correlate to what the discipline should be.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Mark, there's a couple of questions in the chat. Do you want to wait until the end to answer those, or did you want to answer them? There was a couple. I don't know. I can throw them out to you if you want, or Danielle.
No, yeah, I can see them here.
Okay.
Our guidance counselor is not required to have a mental health background, training, and degree. I don't know the answer about that with guidance counselors, what training they get in mental health. I would assume that there's certainly a necessary component to that, but I don't know what's required.
I mean, a school counselor has to have those required coursework, I would say, when they're getting their degree. So there should be some level, at least some level of a background knowledge on mental health. But typically you see mental health therapists that are a little more specifically trained. So I think as a school counselor, you're really kind of well versed in a lot of different things, but it's not going to be as dialed in as perhaps a mental health counselor or therapist.
I found a link on Ohio Department of Education to the standards and evaluation for school counselors, and I'll put that in the chat as well.
Thanks, Renee. And then Kelly had a comment, says, this just happened to a family I do peer support for, not an actual threat, but the child's being forced into a behavior program he doesn't belong, and he's on an IEP. Yeah, and I'll tell you, Kelly, that we see this all the time. We're dealing with threat assessments that shouldn't have been done. By way of example, I had a third grader who during COVID, took his pencil sharpener apart. And, so it was what was left in his desk was a little razor from the pencil sharpener. Kid never been in trouble before. And then, pulled it out and was talking to the kid next to him. And they did a threat assessment on the student. Just as a way to make sure the student wasn't a threat, which I think was number one. They didn't have a protocol for determining who and when they do threat assessments, so it was improperly done to begin with. And then second of all, they accidentally did a risk assessment for suicide because they didn't know the difference, or whoever made the recommendation. The person who received the request didn't know the difference between the risk assessment and a threat assessment. So the parents were beside themselves that this third grader was getting a questionnaire about, whether or not he had thoughts of suicide. And it was just a whole debacle because there wasn't a system in place. Now, I would say that if there's anything good coming out of this, and I hope this is good, I hope it's done with fidelity, but if there's anything good, that there will be a system in place for what signs would lead to a referral for evaluation or assessment, and who would get assessed and who wouldn't. This, like Danielle mentioned, we talked about, this only applies for schools with grades 6 through 12. So It wouldn't even applied in the situation with third grader. There is a little bit of a saving grace with discipline in Ohio because, if there's you can't be suspended or expelled as a K through third grader, with some exceptions. Now, a danger to yourself or others is one of the exceptions, but there is some at least disciplinary saving grace. So yes, we deal with this all the time. We have students who draw pictures that are questionable, that then the teacher or the administrator doesn't know whether or not to refer that student to get a threat assessment done if the picture was an innocent picture, from something from Captain Underpants or something, as opposed to like a picture where the student was actually expressing some need for help or some frustration that where maybe they should be assessed. So hopefully there's some uniformity and attention and study to what students need help and what students, may not need, an assessment. So that's the idea. The risk is that now that schools are required to assess, I'm worried that, so many kids will be assessed or, labeled as a threat, or at least labeled as somebody who had to get a threat assessment done. That's, that in itself could be a black mark, that it ultimately leads to more students in the, in that are being disciplined. More students may be referred to criminal justice system. I mentioned that SROs have to be a part of the threat assessment team. So if one exists in the school, that now there might be this, a more, heavier traveled school to prison pipeline than we've seen before. I just don't know. These are just things that, as parents and as student advocates and as educators and therapists and mental health professionals, that we have to think about to make sure that this is done correctly and we're actually focusing on helping a student who needs help. 3 things with the training that it has to include. It's must be evidence-based, and then it has to provide instruction on identifying behaviors, signs, and threats that may become a violent act, and then determining the seriousness of a threat, and then developing an intervention plan to address it. So, as we've talked a little bit about here, and I have to hurry because we have another presentation to go, but as we've talked a little bit about here, we've had situations where students, just out of frustration, younger students, middle school students, who just say, I'm going to kill you, or they draw a picture of a gun because they've seen it on TV or they've heard adults talk about guns, or like I mentioned, the student who disassembled a pencil sharpener was deemed to potentially be a threat. And of course, the thing we're most likely here to talk about is that students with disabilities whose behaviors may seem or appear as if they're a threat will probably end up being over-identified for students who need a threat assessment. So that's just what we have to be cautious about. And then, it's worth mentioning that all students at some time use questionable behavior and behave in ways that are irrational. So, it's these protocols that these teams ultimately put in place are going to be important. The potential, of flawed assessments or unqualified personnel is a little bit of a risk. The reason I put stereotyping in here and the chance that students with disability and Black students are going to be over-referred is because that happens already. I'm going to jump to the next slide for the sake of time, but students with disabilities are more likely to be referred for suspension, expulsion. African American students, as it lists here, they're already overrepresented in special education, already more likely to be identified as ED, emotionally disturbed. They're already disciplined at 3 times the rate of white students and subjected to more restrictive learning environments compared to white students. So, there's a pretty good likelihood that these same disadvantaged students with disabilities and African American students are going to be over-referred for threat assessments. So what's going to be important about this? And I don't mean to sound like doom and gloom, because this could be a very good thing. But the training for these threat assessment teams has to encourage using qualified team members, has to have accurate assessments, and must absolutely address systemic bias. And that's going to be an important component. Those three things are really going to be important components from our perspective for threat assessment teams. And I want to back up one more step and say, again, this could be a very good, it will be helpful in situations where, students with behaviors are questionable behaviors are assessed and then determined maybe not to be a risk. Maybe if you consider the student's disability and you consider that the student is on an IEP and maybe had a behavior intervention plan that wasn't followed or wasn't followed with fidelity, that maybe it wasn't, maybe the student's not a threat, the student's just not getting the intervention and supports that they needed in the first place. So it's just a complex question that we're hoping that schools and support staff will consider, with the rights of students in mind. A couple quick things I took from the model that was put forth by the Ohio School Safety Center, but just a few things I wanted to point out, and then we'll move on to restraint and seclusion. But like I mentioned, this is public schools only. Assessment of individuals includes students and non-students for the Ohio model, which is interesting because unaffiliated persons or staff or contractors, you wouldn't think you'd walk into a school and potentially be subject to a threat assessment. But, according to the law, you may be included. An interview may be done without parental consent in Ohio. There's no law that requires that parents be notified before the school talks to a student. But this model says that it's not recommended because they want a parental input. They want parents to be notified. And if the parent does ultimately refuse consent when they are notified, just keep in mind as a parent that you can refuse consent for a threat assessment if you don't think it's appropriate. There may be situations, though, where the school then refers it to law enforcement, which of course can interview a child or a student without the consent of the parent. So, there may be situations that warrant denial of consent, but it could also lead to, a quicker referral to law enforcement. School records, they can, there's still confidentiality that applies. But keep in mind that the threat assessment itself and any discipline record is part of the student record, which would be transferred to or given to the school that the student transfers to and maintained in the file where the child and the parent has access. Law enforcement gets the records or access in a health and safety emergency only under FERPA. So it doesn't change anything in regards to who gets access to the record, but just know that threat assessment does become part of the student record. And it doesn't negate any obligation that the school has under IDEA. So, or the ADA. So if the student has an accommodation that they can go talk to the counselor, when they're heightened, forcing the student to go talk to the SRO is still a violation of that. If you, or doing a manifestation determination is another good example. Just because you're doing a threat assessment doesn't negate any obligation that the school has under IDEA. So I'm going to stop there. Why don't we hold our questions, if there are any, to the end, just for the sake of time, because I know Renee and Paige have some information on restraint that they want to provide.
Are you going to pull up the PowerPoint or should I share it from my?
Yeah, I think you can share it if you have it.
Okay. Okay, let's see. Okay, can we see the presentation? Okay, can you see anything else on my computer screen? Okay, perfect. I always have to double check that part as well. So I'll be taking over for restraint and seclusion updates, and I can't really see the clock while I'm presenting. So if Mark or anyone else can just give me some hints on the time as well, that would be very helpful. But to get started, we'll just build off of what Mark and Danielle were talking about with regard to some of those behaviors that we can see in school. Specifically, I was trying to change the slide, specifically with regard to the Ohio Administrative Code, Rule 3301, 3515, which is the rule that was just recently updated in June 2021 that outlines the standards for districts to use when implementing positive behavior intervention supports, as well as crisis intervention, which is usually the use of restraint or seclusion. And the intent of the rule and utilizing these in implementing the positive behavior intervention supports, which I will sort into PBIS, is to really be able to curb those behaviors before they happen, before we need to use those either exclusionary practices like suspension or expulsion, or before we have to use some of those other unwanted crisis intervention like restraint or seclusion. So the reasoning for the enhancement of the rules to try to curb some of those things we're seeing in school. And although the rule has given students a lot more protections and parents more ability to address their grievances with the Ohio Department of Education, the general requirements are still the same overall, and that restraint and seclusion should really only be used as a last resort. And it's if that student's behavior is posing an immediate risk of physical harm or an immediate danger to themselves or those around them, and there's no other effective intervention available. See. And I have the slide up here on positive behavior intervention supports. And so it's a big term that encompasses a lot of different, that encompasses a multi-tiered system of supports. So that PBIS, I said, that positive behavior intervention supports, that's the positive aspect of that is teaching students behaviors that the school wants to see, those the expected or the school-wide behavior, the school-wide expected behaviors, excuse me, that are positive, as well as those skills, with peer modeling or just adult modeling as well, those skills needed to demonstrate those behavior expectations, and acknowledging and reinforcing those expected positive behaviors and creating a safe and supportive environment to be able to do so. And so PBIS is, like I said, it's a multi-tiered systems of support. So we have the pyramid that is giving us an example of what that looks like. So districts are required to have these levels of support that are addressing students' behaviors. And so at the first level, at the bottom in tier 1, we have our universal supports that are given to all students in all students within the building. So all students are taught the school-wide behavior expectations. That's what we see in our student handbooks or our code of conducts, and the skills that are associated with those behavior expectations. And tier 2 is what we move up when those universal supports aren't necessarily enough to reinforce those positive or expected behaviors that we would like to see at school. And that's where we see tier 2, which is a targeted support. And those are students that need more instruction and more opportunities to practice those behavior skills, as they're not able to just learn them with the universal supports. And so that is the second tier of intervention. And that third tier of intervention is what we see a lot of our special education students getting, which is that individualized support. And I just moved there it is. Sorry, I had blocked the slide with the Zoom panelists, but the individualized supports is what we see with our with our functional behavior assessments or our behavior intervention plans, but more individualized supports where we have a team approach with the parents, and whether it's the IEP team or if the student doesn't have an IEP team, a team of knowledgeable staff members, which would have complete that functional behavior assessment and try to figure out where can we intervene with positive behaviors, and how can we make sure that we're reinforcing what the school expected behaviors are looking like. So overall, the the new rule is addressing this PBIS model and not only encouraging, but requiring schools to develop policies that are in line with this. And
Renee,
so-
could I just jump in really quick on
Please.
that slide?
Oh, yes.
I just wanted to say too, the slide that Renee is showing you is part of an FAQ for parents. It's often very confusing when we hear acronyms like PBIS, MTSS, and we hear that, and we really felt the coalition was very lucky to collaborate with the Office for Exceptional Children on creating this document. And so one of the things I just wanted to point out is we wanted to really connect for parents that the S in PBIS is the multi-tiered systems of support. So they understood that there was a connection between those two acronyms, the PBIS and the MTSS. And then also too, that this is for students, the role actually affects general education students, not just students with disabilities. So I just wanted to jump in and say that. Thank you, Renee.
Yes, thank you. And yes, I did steal this from the OECD, from the handout that you sent over
Shared
to me,
it. We
Tammy. Yes.
shared. You didn't steal. We shared.
Oh, I was going to say, I think you cut off. It might have just cut off for me, so I missed what you said, but I know Tammy will be giving that handout at the end. If that was, okay, that was what you were going to say. Thank you. So when in terms of times where positive behavior intervention supports are not working and there is a crisis and a need for a crisis intervention, there are requirements regarding the use of physical restraint and seclusion. That is that the school districts, if the staff must be trained to protect the care, welfare, dignity, and safety of the student. They have to have the specific training to be able to use those crisis intervention techniques. They also have to be able, the staff, while they are using either physical restraint or seclusion, they have to continually observe that student for indications of any distress or to seek any medical assistance. They have to be in constant communication and using strategies to continue to try to de-escalate that student so as to help that student regain control if they are in crisis. And of course, removing the student, they must remove the student immediately from physical restraint or seclusion as soon as that risk of harm to self or others has dissipated. As I said before, that general requirement is still happening, that we still have that general requirement that restraint and seclusion could only be used if that student is a danger to themselves or others. So as soon as that risk is gone, then that student must be removed from the restraint or seclusion. And of course, right after this happens, there needs to be a debriefing with all staff to evaluate the trigger of the behavior and the response, as well as the methods to address the behavior. And in doing that, a mandatory report must be created. And I believe I have this on another slide a little bit later, so I'll touch on it again, but the school will be required to fill out a written report and document any instance of restraint or seclusion within 24 hours, and that must be given to the parent or guardian. I'm going to switch the slides and take a sip of water. So again, restraint and seclusion may only be used as a last resort, and excuse my dog if you can hear him barking in the background. It's only used as a last resort and when that student's behavior is the immediate risk of physical harm to students or others. And of course, there's no other safe or effective intervention available. If there is another effective intervention available, short of restraining or secluding a student, the district is obligated to utilize that. And now, and I'm sorry, I have to keep switching around, where my panelists are on my screen so that I can read the slides in front of me. But again, physical restraint defined in the rule as any physical contact that immobilizes or reduces the ability of a student to move their arms, legs, or body freely. So that doesn't include when any brief physical contact, if a student is being escorted to a safer environment, if a teacher has to intervene to break up a fight, if a student has a weapon in their hand, it needs to be knocked out, or any purposes of comforting or calming a student. And of course, if there is the attempt to prevent an imminent risk of injury, then it is not constituting as a physical restraint. So anything, but really the thing, or the main portion of the rule that is important to remember is that it's any physical contact that is immobilizing or reducing that ability of the student to be able to move their body freely. And I think, let's see. And now some more of those general rules. Again, these kind of seem obvious, but unfortunately, we still see issues with this in schools, unfortunately. But some of the general rules for physical restraint, of course, are that the restraint cannot obstruct the student's ability to breathe, which I forgot the E on the end of there, cannot obstruct the student's ability to breathe or their ability to communicate, because we want to make sure that we're always aware of whether they're in distress or not during that time of restraint or seclusion. And of course, that restraint or seclusion should never be used as a punishment or a discipline. It's only for the safety of the student or staff or their students around them. And so I've been saying physical restraint a lot. And physical restraint, like I said, is that direct immobilization of whether it's a body part, arms, legs, head. And the reason that is specifically defined as physical restraint is because there are several other types of restraint that are prohibited. And that includes chemical restraint, which would be using medication to control behavior. That includes mechanical restraint, which would be a restrictive device that limits a student's movement, which would be handcuffs, or I've heard of students being put in high chairs that are restricting their movement to try and keep them safe in one spot. But those are entirely prohibited. A school may not utilize those in any circumstance. And that includes prone restraint as well, which is a type of physical restraint, but prone restraint is when the student is lying flat or face down on the ground. So there's really a lot of models in here there's really a lot of restrictions within the new restraint rule that are more protective for our students with disabilities. And I see a question. I'm not sure if I have a question in the chat about threatening to tase them. I think, oh, and I skipped forward and ahead. Was that a question that I saw about threatening to tase a student? I'm not sure if that would be considered a restraint. I think any threat, any threat like that would be inappropriate to a student, I would say in general, but I don't know if it would be considered a restraint or a seclusion. I don't know if anyone else on the.
I think it would be, but it would also be considered an assault. So I think I hope that's not happening, actually. If it tries to reduce or eliminate their movement, then absolutely it's a restraint.
Okay, so during the restraint, a child is told to be quiet and threatened to tase. Yeah, that's definitely a prohibited practice. If during the restraint, they're told, within this list, there is interference with the student's ability to communicate. So if they're threatening to tase the student or telling him not to speak, then that's absolutely prohibited. And okay, so next I will, thank you for clearing that. So a little bit into seclusion, on the other side of restraint and seclusion. Seclusion is the involuntary isolation of a student in a room, enclosure, or space from which the student is prevented from physically leaving or by a closed door or other physical barrier. And other physical barrier has been found to include a staff member or teacher that might be blocking a student from being able to leave a room. So even if there's not a closed door, but there's a staff member that's, preventing the student from leaving that room, that can still be considered seclusion. And, we're also looking at when we're defining seclusion as well, when we're talking about whether the student's in a room, an enclosure, or a space where they're being prevented from physically leaving. That could be, it doesn't have to be a small room with no windows. It can even look like a typical classroom that's next door that they're put in by themselves. Paige gave a great example to me earlier where it can even be just putting up big mats and surrounding a student with those big wrestling mats and them not being able to leave was considered seclusion as well. So seclusion is a very broad term that I want to make sure that everyone knows can encompass a lot of different things, but it does not encompass timeout as seclusion. This can be, it has to be, as long as it's used as a behavior intervention, the time is limited and specific, and it's a non-locked setting, oh my goodness, a non-locked setting, so that the student can, self-regulate and begin to control their behavior again. Then timeout would not be considered seclusion, but it's when they are, when they're really prevented from physically leaving and, isolating them for the purpose of that punishment.
Renee, just so you know, it's 12:53.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll go really fast. So general rules for seclusion, it can't be used as a form of discipline. It really just can't be used in any form other than to protect the student from harm to themselves or to other staff or other students in the room. And it can't be used as, as a substitute for student personnel training in PBIS or another form of crisis prevention program. As again, restraint and seclusion should only be last resort for the school. And so the seclusion space cannot be locked. They must have adequate space and lighting. I'm skipping through because I want to make sure we have time for questions. Of course, there cannot be any seclusion that is used for punishment or any aversive behavior interventions. After the school secludes or restrains a student on 3 occasions, the school must have a meeting that takes place within 10 school days of that third incident, to discuss whether FBA needs to be done, a change of placement, or just anything else to help reduce the amount of times that seclusion or restraint is being utilized. The district must have written policies within their Board of Education policies. So I would encourage you guys to look those up within there. They should relatively match the Ohio Administrative Code. The parents should be notified within 24 hours of any instance of physical restraint or seclusion, like I mentioned earlier. Anything should be written and documented within 24 hours and communicated with the parent. A debriefing should happen with the school to allow for the team to discuss for what triggered the student's behavior and actions that could prevent it from happening again. There should be a district level complaint process written into the district policy. There should be additional options for filing a complaint, so that the school can complete an investigation regarding whether the use of restraint or seclusion within the school was appropriate. And overall, and this is my last slide, but overall, if parents are not able to work with school districts, there is the ability to file a complaint at the state level with the Ohio Department of Education. And that's for any alleged violations of the Ohio rule, as we talked about, through sections G through K. And those sections I listed below are just what we talked about, but that's Rule G is with reporting multiple instances of restraint and seclusion. So that's having that meeting after 3 restraints or seclusions. Rule H is training and professional development, which is making sure that the staff that are utilizing these procedures are trained. Rule I, policies and procedures. Again, that is the general rules and requirements for physical restraint and seclusion, and monitoring and reporting are related to the district's monitoring of the restraint and seclusions incidences and their reporting of it to the parent or to the Department of Education. And of course, once you submit a complaint with the Ohio Department of Education, they have 90 days to investigate and issue a letter of findings. And I know I ran through that pretty quickly at all the end, but that is my last slide. So I'm happy to answer any more questions because I know I just had to run through at the end.
Renee, can I jump into just add a quick thing for parents as well? And I know I had said previously that this is a general education role as well. So when the meetings are being called and when we're talking about interventions and developing FBAs and IEP, there's also, I think there is a component in here that might trigger a parent to wanting to request an IEP. So in that document that I put in the chat for the parents FAQ, we also have a template in there So if that child's not identified yet and you're having multiple incidents where you're calling a meeting, so after 3, you definitely are probably looking at child find and having the parents request an evaluation be done. So I just wanted to throw that in there as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Tammy. Thanks, Renee. All right, so we do have a few minutes now for Q&A, and Fatima put a question in the box I'll read. What steps can a parent take if this process is not followed properly by the school, including if evidence of not following the correct process is concealed?
Yeah, so that would be either submitting a complaint to the district, or if it's sounding like the district is not really wanting to work with the family if they are concealing some of the processes, that would be a complaint at the state level through the Ohio Department of Education. You have up to 1 year to submit any complaints related to restraint and seclusion, and they will complete an investigation within 90 days and be able to issue corrective actions if the district did act inappropriately with the restraint or seclusion that they used.
All right. We'll leave it open for other questions too. Again, you could drop them in the Q&A.
I'm also going to share in the chat too that there are modules. If anybody wants to take a look at that, they're mainly for districts, but parents can take a look at those as well. It really lays out the role and what's required. And I know a lot of times that when complaints are being filed and some of the corrective actions, they're actually having the districts refer to those modules and go back to be trained on the role. So I'll share that in the chat as well.
Thank you, Tammy. All right, let me see if do you have any workshops available for children? Well, we don't as of now, although you know, whoever, you know, these are open to anyone who wants to join. I don't know, you know, if they're necessarily child or student friendly, but you know, anyone can join these workshops, and they are recorded. So one thing to consider, even after we get done today, we'll it'll take a couple days, but we'll put the recorded workshop up on that's the same URL I mentioned, lawyersforstudents.com/legal clinic. And the prior workshops, so I mentioned this is the 4th one in the series, the prior workshops are also recorded, and there's a link right next to the name of the workshop that you can click on. I also mentioned this is the 3rd series of workshops we've done. Almost all of the other workshops that we've done, at least 95% of them, are recorded with the link next to it, so that you have access to watch it on demand. You know, it's on YouTube. So yeah, so anyone's welcome to join. They aren't, you know, geared for students, but certainly available if they want to watch them. And that looks like it's going to be it. And thank you very much, Renee and Tammy and Danielle and Paige. We'll be back next month for, let me take a look and see what the next month's workshop is. Oh yeah, Assistive Technology by Disability Rights Ohio on January 16th. And yeah, same time, 3rd Monday of the month at noon. We'll be back for another one. So thank you all for joining, and then thanks for the panel.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.